He married 2 nieces, both 16 years old, the most unsettling patriarch to emerge from West Virginia. Deep within the isolated valleys of Appalachia, hidden from the gaze of wider civilization, are dark tales of families that time has forgotten, buried like secrets no one dares to uncover. This is Elijah Blackwood's story, a man whose legacy of control and perversion twisted generations of a single family into victims of their own corrupted bloodlines. Between 1927 and 1978, within the rugged mountains of West Virginia, one of the most documented and disturbing family dynasties in the region took shape. Born in 1897 in a tiny, secluded valley in McDowell County, Elijah Blackwood grew up in a separate world where geographical isolation dictated not just their way of life, but also the interactions between the few families living there. The Appalachian Mountains are historically known for sheltering isolated communities. In the early 20th century, many of these communities existed with virtually no interaction with the world outside. Roads were often non-existent or treacherous, forcing families to rely solely on themselves for survival. In this environment of extreme isolation, marriage patterns that would be considered utterly taboo elsewhere sometimes became a quiet, accepted reality. The seeds of control. Elijah was the eldest of 8 siblings. His father, Thomas Blackwood, was known regionally for his severe methods in raising children and his domineering personality. Elijah's mother, Sarah, was Thomas's second cousin, an arrangement not unusual within the isolated communities of that era. The family survived on hunting and subsistence farming, rarely venturing down to the larger valley towns. In 1915, when Elijah turned 18, his father sent him to work in the coal mines just beginning to open up in the area. This was his initial real exposure to the world beyond the isolated valley where he'd spent his life. There, among the other miners, Elijah encountered different ideas and people, but he also developed a superiority complex toward outsiders. He became convinced that his family lineage was purer, viewing people from outside as inferior. After 3 years in the mines, in 1918, Elijah returned to the valley after an accident left a deep scar across his face. The subsequent isolation only intensified his controlling tendencies. Upon his father's death in 1923, Elijah, then 26, assumed the mantle of family patriarch. It was during this period that worrying signs began to surface in Elijah's behavior. He wielded absolute control over his younger siblings, especially his sisters, Eleanor and Margaret. The compound forms. In 1925, he orchestrated the marriage of Margaret, then 22, to Jeremiah Tucker, a man 15 years her senior who owned property nearby. The condition Elijah imposed for the marriage was that the couple had to remain living on Blackwood land, under his direct supervision. The following year, 1926, Eleanor was likewise coerced into marriage, this time to Robert Harris, a distant cousin. Again, Elijah insisted the couple live under his roof. Thus began the formation of what would later be known as the Blackwood Compound, a small collection of structures and cabins where Elijah held the entire family under his sway. Between 1927 and 1930, Margaret bore 3 daughters, Hannah, Ruth, and Abigail. Eleanor, in turn, had 2 daughters, Mary and Esther. Elijah took an unsettling interest in his nieces, constantly interfering in their upbringing and setting rigid rules for their education. In those days, the geographic isolation of families like the Blackwoods meant virtually no external oversight. Authorities rarely visited these remote areas, and schools were too far away for regular attendance. This isolation enabled Elijah to solidify his power over the family with no external scrutiny. As the girls matured, Elijah increasingly cut off their contact with the outside world. They did not attend school, receiving their education at home, mainly from their mothers and Elijah himself, who indoctrinated them with a distorted family history and the importance of maintaining a pure bloodline. Incest and inbreeding depression. Elijah's truly disturbing behavior became apparent in 1943, the year Esther and Ruth both turned 16. That year, both of his sisters' husbands, Robert and Jeremiah, died under suspicious circumstances. Robert succumbed to a sudden illness, and Jeremiah died in a hunting accident. Although no formal investigations occurred at the time due to the compound's isolation, later accounts from younger family members suggested Elijah may have orchestrated both deaths. With his sisters now widowed and entirely dependent on him, Elijah announced he would marry his niece, Ruth, Margaret's daughter. The marriage was conducted in a private ceremony within the compound itself, lacking the presence of any recognized religious or civil authorities. Margaret, having been subjugated by her brother for years and fearing for her own life, could not object. Just 3 months later, in an even more shocking act of depravity, Elijah declared he would also marry Esther, Eleanor's daughter, and his other 16-year-old niece. This second marriage proceeded with the same lack of official record. It is crucial to understand the historical context. Though consanguineous marriages were legally banned in West Virginia in the 1940s, the state had prohibited marriages between uncles and nieces since its founding. These laws had little practical effect in remote regions where civil records were rarely maintained and authorities were absent. In the ensuing years, Ruth bore 4 of Elijah's children, 2 girls and 2 boys. Esther had 3 children, 1 boy and 2 girls. It was in this first generation of children from these incestuous relationships that the genetic consequences of consanguinity began to manifest visibly. Of the 7 children born, 5 experienced serious health issues. 3 presented with evident physical deformities, including synendactyly, fused fingers, facial malformations, and spinal problems. 2 others exhibited what was then termed mental debility, now recognized as significant intellectual disability. Intervention and investigation. By the 1950s, the isolation of the Blackwood compound began to slightly erode as road construction advanced through the region. In 1952, an itinerant doctor who provided basic health care to remote communities stumbled upon the Blackwood family. Horrified by the conditions, particularly the children's state, he attempted to alert the authorities. However, government intervention in family matters was much more restricted then, and mountain families were known for their profound distrust of outsiders and authorities. When county officials finally visited the compound, Elijah provided falsified documents claiming that Ruth and Esther were wives from neighboring, unrelated communities. The women, terrorized by years of abuse and manipulation, confirmed his fabricated story. The initial investigation was closed, but the case drew the attention of Dr. Charles Montgomery, a physician keenly interested in the nascent field of genetics. In 1954, Dr. Montgomery obtained permission to examine some of the compound's children, ostensibly as part of a rural health initiative. In his notes, which would be found only decades later, Montgomery carefully recorded the children's health problems. He noted the high frequency of congenital deficiencies and correctly surmised they were the result of close consanguinity. Though understanding of genetics was limited compared to today, the increased risk of recessive diseases from consanguineous relationships was already known. Montgomery wrote, "The patterns of anomalies seen in the Blackwood children align with what scientific literature describes as resulting from close consanguinity. The incidence of cognitive impairment and physical malformations is dramatically higher than expected in the general population. The circumstances that led to this situation in this isolated family are alarming." Despite his suspicions, Montgomery faced opposition from local authorities and the family. In rural Appalachian communities of the 1950s, family issues were considered strictly private, and there was a cultural reluctance to interfere, even when faced with evidence of illicit or abusive behavior. Escalation and escape. Meanwhile, the situation within the compound worsened. Between 1955 and 1960, Elijah fathered 5 more children with his nieces. 3 of these 5 died before their first birthday due to multiple health complications. While infant mortality was common in impoverished rural areas then, these deaths did not raise immediate alarms. A critical turning point occurred in 1962, when Hannah, Margaret's second daughter and Ruth's sister, managed to escape at age 33. Having endured Elijah's tyrannical rule her entire life, Hannah finally found the courage to flee. After witnessing years of abuse, she made a difficult 3-day trek through the mountains to the town of Welsh, where she reported her story to local police. Initially, her account was met with disbelief. Having lived her life in total isolation, Hannah had limited understanding of the outside world and difficulty communicating. Furthermore, her accusations were so severe that many officials considered them exaggerated or fictitious. It wasn't until Thomas Ricks, a young social worker new to the county social services department, decided to pursue the case diligently that the authorities began to take the allegations seriously. Ricks, unbound by the local codes of silence and old networks of influence common in small rural communities, was determined to uncover the truth. Arrest and trial. In October 1962, Ricks organized an official visit to the Blackwood compound, accompanied by 2 state police officers. The scene they encountered was profoundly disturbing. The compound had expanded to 6 main structures, housing approximately 30 people, all under the absolute control of Elijah, then 65 years old. Living conditions were deplorable. Many children, with clear health problems and deficiencies, suffered from neglect and extreme poverty. Some of the young adults and teenagers, children born from Elijah's relationships with Ruth and Esther, showed distinct signs of consanguinity, including characteristic facial features like closely set eyes, prominent foreheads, and receding jaws. More horrifying still, Ricks found evidence that Elijah had started relationships with some of his own daughter's grandnieces, perpetuating the cycle of incest and abuse. Confronted with the evidence, the authorities finally acted. Elijah was arrested along with 2 of his older sons, who had become his accomplices in family control. The women and children were removed from the compound and taken for psychological and medical evaluation. The subsequent 1963 court case was unprecedented for the region and time. Elijah faced multiple charges, including incest, illegal confinement, and child abuse. During the trial, held behind closed doors because of the sensitive nature of the accusations, disturbing details emerged about how Elijah maintained control. For decades, he had cultivated an almost religious belief system, convincing family members that the outside world was dangerous and corrupt, and that they could only remain pure and safe by adhering to his rules. Psychological manipulation, combined with physical isolation, had enabled his regime of terror to persist for generations. Genetic evidence and sentencing. Medical experts who testified presented clear evidence of the physical and psychological effects of prolonged incest on the family. Dr. William Patterson, a geneticist from the University of Virginia who examined several children, explained to the court, "What we are observing in the younger members of the Blackwood family is consistent with the phenomenon known as inbreeding depression, the expression of harmful recessive genetic traits due to breeding between closely related individuals." Patterson elaborated, "In normal populations, harmful recessive genes rarely cause problems because the individual typically inherits only one copy of the defective gene, which is compensated by a healthy copy from the other parent. However, when close relatives reproduce, the probability of a child inheriting 2 copies of the same harmful recessive gene increases dramatically." The evidence included a high rate of infant mortality among Elijah's descendants, around 40% compared to the national average of approximately 2% at the time. A significantly elevated incidence of congenital malformations, including heart defects, skeletal abnormalities, and cleft palate. Widespread intellectual disability, with almost 70% of the living children showing some degree of cognitive impairment. Severe immunological problems that made the children highly susceptible to infections. Delayed physical development and reduced stature in nearly all descendants. A particularly unsettling detail revealed during the trial was the founder effect that had taken hold in the Blackwood lineage. This genetic phenomenon occurs when a new population is established by a very small group from a larger population, leading to diminished genetic diversity. In the Blackwoods case, generations of consanguineous marriages cause certain rare recessive genetic traits to become common within the family. A striking example was a rare type of polydactyly, extra fingers, combined with synendactyly, fused fingers, creating a distinctive hand malformation that afflicted nearly 30% of the children born in the compound. In December 1963, Elijah Blackwood was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in Moundsville State Prison in 1978 at age 81, having, by all accounts, never expressed remorse for his actions. The survivor's journey. The victims' fates were diverse. The adult women, including Ruth and Esther, then 36, faced immense difficulties adapting to life outside the compound. Having been manipulated and subjugated their entire lives, many grappled with mental health issues, including what is now known as complex post-traumatic stress disorder. The younger children were placed either in foster homes or, for those with the most severe disabilities, in specialized care institutions. Follow-up records indicate that even those without visible physical deformities often developed health issues linked to consanguinity later in life, such as rare metabolic disorders, autoimmune diseases, and reduced fertility. In 1970, 7 years after the trial, West Virginia University initiated a longitudinal study to monitor the Blackwood family survivors. This study, which continued until 1985, provided some of the first systematic data on the long-term impacts of sustained consanguinity in a human population. Among the most crucial findings was the persistence of genetic problems, even in individuals who appeared physically normal. Many survivors without visible anomalies were still carriers of multiple recessive genetic mutations that could potentially affect their own children if they married people who coincidentally carried the same recessive genes. The study also documented the surprisingly high prevalence of specific rare disorders among the Blackwood descendants. For instance, Usher syndrome type 2, a genetic condition causing progressive blindness and deafness, was identified in 8 family members, a rate hundreds of times higher than the general population. Another revealing aspect was the pattern of neurological development. Even children without a significant intellectual disability frequently exhibited atypical cognitive development patterns, including specific difficulties with executive functions, abstract reasoning, and spatial processing. These discoveries contributed to the developing understanding of the genetic foundation and complexity of neurological development. Legacy and impact. The Blackwood case's legacy reaches beyond the direct consequences for the family. It profoundly influenced child protection policies in West Virginia and other states. The case was repeatedly cited throughout the 1970s in legislative debates stressing the need to strengthen intervention mechanisms and child protection laws in abusive families. In 1974, when the U.S. Congress passed the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, creating the first federal program specifically for child protection, the Blackwood case was mentioned as an extreme instance of how a lack of external supervision and isolation can allow abuse to continue for generations. From a scientific standpoint, the case yielded valuable data for the emerging field of behavioral genetics. While modern research ethics prohibit similar studies, the data gathered from the Blackwood survivors, always with appropriate consent, helped clarify the complex interaction between environment and genetics in human development. For example, among the Blackwood siblings who were raised in different foster homes, those who received intensive and early educational intervention often significantly surpassed initial expectations based on their genetic profile, demonstrating the powerful influence of the environment on development, even in the presence of significant genetic predispositions. A less discussed aspect of the case is its impact on the Appalachian communities themselves. For decades, the Blackwood story was sensationally exploited by the media to reinforce negative stereotypes of mountain inhabitants as inbred hillbillies. This unfair characterization obscured the complex social and economic realities of the region. Later demographic studies, in fact, showed that the rates of consanguineous marriages in Appalachia were not substantially different from those in other rural American areas during the same time period. What made the Blackwood case exceptional was the deliberate and extreme nature of the abuse perpetrated by a deeply disturbed individual, not the cultural context. Healing and redemption. In 1982, a PBS documentary titled The Children of the Shadows revisited the case, featuring interviews with some adult survivors who consented to share their stories. The documentary was groundbreaking for its sensitive handling of such a delicate subject and for providing a voice to the victims. One of the most impactful interviewees was Sarah, Elijah, and Ruth's daughter, who was 12 when the compound was discovered. Then 31, Sarah had conquered tremendous adversity. Despite being born with a spinal malformation that restricted her mobility and facing considerable learning difficulties, she had finished high school and become an advocate for people with disabilities. In the documentary, Sarah reflected, "People often ask me if I hate my father. The truth is, I barely remember him as a person. He was more like a dark force that hovered over all of us. What I feel most is sadness. Sadness for what could have been. Sadness for lives ruined before they even began." Another survivor interviewed was Michael, Elijah, and Esther's son, rescued at age 8. Unlike many of his cousins and siblings, Michael presented no severe physical anomalies. Although he suffered from a rare blood disease requiring constant treatment, he spoke openly about the struggle to forge a normal identity after growing up in such extraordinary circumstances. For years, I never told anyone about my past. I felt ashamed, as if it was somehow my fault. It wasn't until I started working with a therapist in college that I understood I was a victim, not someone who should be ashamed. Understanding the science behind what happened to our family also helped. Knowing that the health problems we face have a rational explanation, and not some kind of curse, as Elijah made us believe. The psychological impact on the survivors was as profound as the physical consequences. Many struggled with self-esteem, identity issues, and the capacity to form healthy relationships. Those who eventually chose to have children often described intense anxiety about their descendants' health, even when marrying genetically unrelated partners. Emily, one of Elijah's few daughters who managed to lead a relatively normal life and start her own family, described in the documentary the terror she felt during her pregnancy. Every prenatal exam was torture. I was certain something would be wrong, that somehow my father's sins would be visited upon my innocent child. When my daughter was born perfectly healthy, I couldn't stop crying with relief. The Blackwood story also raised vital questions about how societies treat survivors of extreme trauma. In the immediate years following the compound's discovery, the institutional response was often inadequate and fragmented. Many children were separated not just from their abusive parents but also from siblings and other relatives who could have provided a sense of connection and continuity. Though well-intentioned, this separation often compounded the trauma of already devastated lives. It was only in the 1970s, with the rise of more holistic approaches to caring for traumatized children, that social services began to acknowledge the importance of preserving sibling bonds and offering specialized therapy for victims of familial abuse. A lasting warning. In 1978, the same year Elijah died in prison, a group of adult Blackwood survivors established an informal support group that later became the New Roots Foundation. This non-profit organization, which is still active, works to educate the public about consanguinity and child abuse, while also offering support to individuals born in similar circumstances. A particularly notable aspect of the foundation is its collaboration with the social service and medical communities to raise awareness about the unique health needs of people with a history of family consanguinity. They have created educational materials that help health professionals identify rare conditions that may be more common in this population, enabling earlier and more effective interventions. In 1985, Dr. Robert Jenkins, a geneticist who worked extensively with the Blackwood survivors, published an influential study in the journal Medical Genetics that helped clarify some of the specific mechanisms by which prolonged consanguinity impacts human health. The study identified over 30 rare genetic conditions present in the Blackwood family, many of which were virtually unknown in the general population. Jenkins observed, "What makes the Blackwood case scientifically significant is not simply the extent of the consanguinity, but its deliberate, multi-generational nature. Unlike isolated communities where cousin marriage happens out of demographic necessity, here there was a directed selection for extremely close relationships, creating a tragically revealing natural experiment on the effects of inbreeding in humans." Among the most surprising findings was the identification of a previously unknown genetic variant that affected vitamin D metabolism, contributing to the high rates of rickets and other skeletal deformities observed in Blackwood children. This discovery later led to advancements in the treatment of certain rare forms of vitamin D-resistant rickets. As the 1980s went on and the younger survivors reached adulthood, new challenges emerged. Many faced tough decisions about whether to have their own children given their complex genetic background. Some opted not to have biological children, while others pursued extensive genetic counseling and prenatal testing, an area of medicine just beginning to develop at the time. In 1992, nearly 30 years after the compound was first discovered, a remarkable reunion took place. 17 adult Blackwood survivors, many of whom hadn't seen each other since childhood, gathered in Charleston, West Virginia, to celebrate their journeys of recovery and share their stories. The event, organized by the New Roots Foundation, was closed to the public and media, providing a safe space for healing and reconnect. One participant, who chose to remain anonymous, later shared the experience. "It felt like finding pieces of a puzzle I didn't even know were missing. Looking into the faces of people who shared not just my blood but my experiences, it was overwhelming, but also incredibly healing. For the first time, I was in a room full of people who truly understood. The Blackwood case's legacy continues to resonate across numerous fields. In medical genetics, the data collected over decades of following the survivors contributed to our understanding of how recessive genes express themselves and interact. In child protection services, the case remains a powerful study on the necessity of community vigilance and the dangers of extreme isolation. For the people of Appalachia, the story serves as a reminder of the resilience required to overcome not only the adversities of geographic isolation and poverty but also the burden of negative stereotypes that have long afflicted the region. Perhaps the most crucial legacy, however, is that of the survivors themselves. Many transformed their traumatic experiences into strength to aid others. Some became advocates, teachers, nurses, and social workers, utilizing their first-hand knowledge of recovery and trauma to effect positive change. As Rebecca, one of Elijah's granddaughters who became a child psychologist, expressed, "For a long time, the darkness my grandfather created defined our family." But that's not the whole story. We are also defined by our survival, by our refusal to let the past dictate our future. Every time I use my experience to help a traumatized child find hope, I feel like I'm rewriting a bit of that history. In 1998, when the final formal follow-up study of the Blackwood survivors concluded, the researchers noted something remarkable. Despite the immense psychological and genetic adversities, a surprising number of the survivors had managed to build stable and, in many instances, extraordinary lives. This unexpected resilience challenged many initial assumptions about the prognosis for children born into such extreme circumstances. The final report concluded, perhaps the most important lesson from the Blackwood case is not solely about the consequences of consanguinity, but about the remarkable capacity of the human spirit to transcend even the most traumatic origins when given adequate support and opportunity. The case of Elijah Blackwood remains one of the most disturbing documented examples of manipulation and family abuse in the United States. It is a dark tale of how a domineering individual's personality, combined with isolation, can generate generations of suffering. But ultimately, it is also a story about the potential for redemption and healing, even in the most improbable situations. In the words of one survivor, Elijah thought he was creating a dynasty with himself as the supreme ruler, one that would last forever. Instead, his legacy is to serve as a warning to the world about the dangers of unsupervised isolation and unchecked power. If anything positive emerged from this horror, it is the determination of so many of us to ensure nothing similar ever happens again. Today, the mountains of West Virginia are vastly different from the days of Elijah Blackwood. Roads now reach the remotest valleys. The internet connects even the most isolated communities to the outside world, and child protection systems are far more vigilant. Yet, the Blackwood story endures as a powerful reminder that the most terrible abuses can take place not only in the dark alleys of cities but also under the open sky of the mountains, where isolation and silence can conceal the most unsettling human truths.